The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Thank you. No, it's true that I wrote one big book. Actually, I wrote one big book, and it was 600,000 words in length. And they said, "Oh, we can't have anything more than 300,000." So it took me a year to cut it back, and every one was like, killing my dog or my pet or my child or something. Every word in it, and then I turned it in 293,000 words and. One of the new editors I said, "This is too long. We need something about half this size." And I showed him the email that said it had to be under 300,000, and that was the last I heard of it. So the publisher and I met about it, and we had a big argument. I wanted one volume, he wanted two. I lost, but it was great because I was able to spend the next 2 years refining this book, which I could tell the language needed work, the writing mainly, and also the accumulation of time. You add new facts to it as well. So I was happy that's how it worked out. My publisher was Peter Mayer of Overlook Press. I didn't know it, but when we first talked, he was CEO of Viking Penguin of New York and London at the same time. I mean, I couldn't talk anyway, but I was so dumbfounded by being asked. And he's still around, and he is still going strong. He's in his late 80s, and still a close friend. I thought I would talk a bit about women in Hudson Valley history today, and actually concentrate on the second book. These are like the references I made in the second book to women, so you can imagine, getting the two together, how difficult that would be. As a matter of fact, we've talked about possibly doing an encyclopedia of women in the Hudson Valley as a follow-up book, and I'm not sure if I want to take on that task, but I've got a lot of basic information already. And I'll talk mainly about the new book, which takes off from the period after the Civil War. The first book, as you may recall, ends with the funeral train of Abraham Lincoln passing up through the valley in 1865. And I open with the Gilded Age, which I call the Age of Sheen, and that period of time. And I talk a little bit about the Civil War in terms of U.S. Grant and Mark Twain, Sam and Sam. They both had the same nicknames. And Grant, as you know or may know, came up to Mount McGregor above Saratoga to finish his memoirs and to die, really. And Twain came along with him, having convinced him that he needed Twain to publish his book. And Twain was the perfect person for it. Grant had been hoodwinked and bamboozled and tricked by many people in his naivete over the later years. And that was happening also with the so-called publisher he had then, and Twain just promised him everything, all of the returns on it. Twain did not take a fee or a salary for it. And after the book was, and he created a publishing company at that year also, and they published 2 books in that year. One was the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant, and the other was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And both of them became phenomenal bestsellers. And U.S. Grant his widow wound up receiving $400,000 from Mark Twain for the proceeds of the book. Twain carried on quite an amazing campaign to sell the book. It is still considered the finest American military biography ever written. Twain compared it to Julius Caesar's commentaries, and others have as well, I think. When I was a kid, I read my Grant. It was one of those big, heavy books you found in the attic, 2 volumes. Remember how heavy they were? And I didn't tell my friends because they would have joked about some old military guy. But I couldn't put it down. It was just a great read, and I commend it to anyone who has the time and can lift the damn thing. But Getting to the women's history, I'd like to go a little bit back in time and also talk a little bit about this place, this area. One of the first people who comes to mind is Mother Ann Lee. You know, of course, that she was buried where the airport is, and they had to move her grave in the 1920s to make room for that. And the Shaker community is right here, of course. I'm not going to go into her history too much. I assume that you know it or it's readily accessible to you. But she was quite a remarkable person and came here with a mission, and as her believers felt, as the representation of reincarnation of God here in the New World, or in the world. Of course, she had some other habits or peccadillos that were a little bit odd. She could beat up her brother, for one thing, I think. And so, and she got arrested for treason and thrown in jail in Poughkeepsie until the governor finally threw his hands up and said, let her go. Maybe she'll go home and preach or something. And, well, I should use this, huh? So Mother Ann is one of the seminal figures in Hudson Valley history and in religious history because of the Shakers and what they brought to the table. And at one point when I was writing this book, well, toward the end of it, I stopped and I realized how lucky I was. I mean, I could live in North Dakota or somewhere and be writing about that region, but here it is, what the U.S. Congress called the region that defined America. And my luck, it falls to me. If that had happened when I was, my knowledge or understanding of that had happened when I first started out, I probably would have collapsed and not been able to do a thing. But fortunately, I was naive enough to just, pile my way through it all in the process. Jenny Augusta Brownscombe, Brownscombe. Nobody knows her today. She lived in Palinville, down below the escarpment, down below the pine orchard where the Catskill Mountain House was. During the 1890s to 1920 or 30, during the period when the rise in cultural tourism was so great for that area, and people would come up to visit the areas where Thomas Cole walked, where Asher Duran walked, where some of the great painters were. And Jenny was a painter. She was a very good painter, and she came up and she lived with an older man in a kind of a daughter-father relationship, and he was also the representative painter for Palinville at the time. She was known as a genre painter. If we were to characterize her succinctly, we would call her the Norman Rockwell of her time. And those are the kinds of paintings that she made. And she was very good at it and was well recognized at the time. Alas, who knows about her today? We also are fortunate to have had the home called Wincliffe, where Elizabeth Skirmahorn Jones built. And I think that property was just sold recently. It's a romantic ruin, as they call them today. They're not just dumps anymore. They're romantic ruins. Well, this was like the most expensive house ever built during the period after the Civil War. And it's where we get the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. Elizabeth Jones was related to the Astors as well. And I want to talk about the Astor women and the Livingston women a little bit later as a group, because they had such an amazing influence on the valley. Margaret Osborne lived down in Garrison. She was responsible for the Appalachian Trail coming up through the Hudson Valley in that area. She was the one who made the final connection between the New England part of the trail and the New Jersey part of the trail. Her family was very active in Hudson Highlands activities. You all know the name Frances Xavier Cabrini, St. Frances Cabrini, the first woman, thank you, canonized as a saint, the first native-born person canonized as a saint. Well, the first of her orphanages, she established 63 orphanages for Italian children in the period from the turn of the century, before the turn of the century on. And the first of those was in West Park here in the Hudson Valley. Mary Harriman. Oh, she was known as the richest woman in the world after her husband died. They always have to add after her husband died. You know, I don't know what that's about. Maybe she was before then too. Her husband was Ned Harriman, the railroad baron. But Mary was really the power behind the throne. And after he died, she went through with the gifting of land to the state of New York, the Palisades Park Commission at Bear Mountain. She completed the gifting of the entire of Harriman State Park. She funded almost everything that happened at the Goshen racetrack, which was the most famous horse racing track before Saratoga became that. And she also built the Bear Mountain Bridge. Actually, she and her son undertook that. And the Bear Mountain Bridge, which was the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time, they all are at the time, the family owned it for the first 30 years. It was not a state project. And it is quite a bridge, and if you've ever seen it, I mean, you know the setting in that, it's just awe-inspiring. Emily Post, oh boy, Emily Post was, let's see, what was her maiden name? Price, Emily Price Post. Her father built most of the houses in Tuxedo Park, which was the most exclusive residential area in the valley and in the Northeast, actually. Emily Post, it was said, was one of only 2 or 3 women in America who could walk across a ballroom floor properly. I think the women would understand that better than the men. But it reminds me of my days with Maurice Hinchey in the Assembly, and of course it's it's a great facility and it's full of very talented and marvelous people. Many of the staff are women, and they were not paid the same as the men. Probably it's the same true now, but they recognized what they were doing. How they, along with the rest of us, were working for the gods of good government, so to speak. And in our office was the office manager was a woman named Carol Warren. And she, I hate, as a male, I hate to say this, but she looked great in heels, and I can't comment enough about that. And because Carol was one of those feisty Albany legislature people who knew all of the old stories, and knew all of the tales. Diana Petrillo is here with me, and she worked there too, and she knew Carol well. Emily Post, oh yeah. So you all know what Emily Post did. She taught us proper manners. And do we still follow Emily Post? Are we still reading Emily Post these days? Mine might be back where that U.S. Grant book was in my parents' attic, I'm not sure. But I don't remember getting into it too much myself. She understood what happened to Tuxedo Park. It became known as the graveyard of the aristocracy by the 1940s because all the old families that were there had aged out, and money had taken on new tones ever since that damn Roosevelt created the income tax, or raised the tax on all the rich people, and was called the traitor to his own class because of it. Emily Post figured that was probably the reason that Tuxedo Park fell into desuetude, as you say. There's never been anything like it since, and some of the houses are still there, and it is still a private community. These are Astor people, so let's wait a second with them. I want to jump forward to Olive Sarr. Olive Sarr was a companion of George Seaman. George Seaman, S-E-A-M-O-N, made his money developing cigarette advertising in the world. So you can imagine the kind of money he made. And he decided after he retired that he wanted to build a special place, like a cultural boarding house, so to speak, for his rich friends. So he created Yama no Uchi, Yama Farms it's called. It was a huge estate like Mohonk on the side of the Roundout Valley, and it looked over toward Mohonk. you didn't make a reservation for Yamanouchi. You were invited to come. And you didn't pay a bill at the end. You paid beforehand, or you worked it out later on. And you paid, and you paid. But the services were unbelievable. George Seaman would routinely drive down to the city and bring people up until the railroad came in, and then they had their own railroad car that would come around. One man showed up with his chauffeur, and the chauffeur pulled up to the front door of the office and got out and unscrewed the hood ornament on the car and walked in and put it in the vault in the office and closed the door until they came back. The hood ornament, which was studded with diamonds and sapphires, was worth $35,000. So Nelson Rockefeller had his honeymoon there. Pulteney Bigelow, John Burroughs, well, the four, what they call them, the four friends, Burroughs, Ford, Firestone, and who was that other guy? Well, I can't remember, but they routinely came to Yama Farms, and there was a Burroughs night. Wild Bill Cody came there with his stagecoach and the whole shooting match related to that. Olive Sarr was important because she designed the estate. She and George were in Japan 8 years before Frank Lloyd Wright went there. And Frank Lloyd Wright's trip there influenced his architecture and modern architecture tremendously. Well, Olive Sarr came back and built this beautiful estate along Japanese themes. And it was written up in all of the important papers at the time. But now that too has been grown over by the forests, and there are pieces of it still there, but it's hard to make it out. She also had one of the finest collections of English porcelain in the world, and some flour that they collected, I can't remember, it was the most important collection in the world. They had the best chickens, the best of everything in terms of first-class provisions for the place. And the property remained as that for about 30 years until they both passed on, and then the property kind of itself passed on. It's now not even a romantic ruin. It's right next to a mobile home park, actually, and there's very few elements of it that remain. So I want to talk about my 300 daughters. That's what Matthew Vassar called his students at Vassar College. And of course I can't go through all of the women who are note there. It takes up a whole section in the book. But it is remarkable, and remarkable what he did. It was actually a niece of his that before she died young, and she urged him to provide a college for women along the lines of Harvard and Yale, a college of the same caliber as the great colleges for men. And of course, men thought that was crazy at the time. But Vassar did it and insisted on it. He fought his own family over it. And the institution, right from the start, was a unique and important one. Some of the important people there were Maria Mitchell, who was the first astronomy teacher in America and was an expert in that, and she caused the construction of the astronomy building at Vassar, which was just the second building built after Maine, which is their main hall. But the students themselves were the remarkable people. One of them was Inez Mulholland, who, when the suffragist movement came in 1915 and 16, she led the parade down Fifth Avenue in New York on a white horse because she looked like the Statue of Liberty. And she was very tall, beautiful blonde hair, wore a beautiful white or cream-colored gown, and carried the damn torch. And I'll tell you, she really did it up well. She died of exhaustion on the suffrage trail within a year or two of that. Adelaide Crapsey was another woman who became a famous writer. Jean Webster. Jean Webster wrote Daddy Longlegs. That became a Fred Astaire vehicle in the theaters. But the most important of the figures to come out of it, or at least the most well-known, was Edna St. Vincent Millay. Edna Millay was accepted into Vassar after she went through a 3-year kind of apprentice program at Barnard, which was common among students who didn't have a good high school education at that time. She was already famous. She had already published Renaissance, her most famous poem. And like Renaissance, Vassar was itself the institution that was facing life in a new and fresh fashion and opening up to the whole possibilities of life. Edna had a little trouble. She called herself Vincent. Vincent had a little trouble at Vassar. She kept getting into trouble. And she was grounded all the while. And one time, she and some friends took off on a lark when she was grounded and wound up at a tea room near the Shokan Reservoir and made witty little comments in the guest book. And everything was all right, but the next day, the warden of her dormitory wing came to the same tea room and saw everything written there. All was lost, Edna told reporters in 1932. She was not allowed to graduate until Henry Noble McCracken, the president of Yale, overruled, for the only time in his whole career, he overruled a faculty decision. He had gotten a strong objection from the student body, so he allowed her to come and graduate in 1917 with her class. And of course, Edna St. Vincent Millay went on to become a great poet, the first woman to receive the Nobel Literature in poetry, and really only the second person to receive it also, and lived and established a home at Steepletop, right across the river, so to speak. I was over in that area yesterday. She had some unusual ideas, as did other women who were associated with the Valley. Edna was a free love advocate, for one thing. Margaret Sanger is another one. Now, Margaret Sanger is of course responsible for the birth control movement. At one time she advocated a birth strike. Well, that didn't go over too well. And she and her sister got thrown in jail a couple of times over the issue. The sister actually went on a hunger strike, and that brought in the sympathy of most of the newspapers of the Mid-Hudson area where they had been advocating some of their work. And it was strange, but the whole print industry came behind the birth control movement and said, "Why? What's wrong here? What's going on? We should try and do this." One of the darker sides of Edna Millay, I think I'll read it to you if I can find it. Here we are. Concerned her passion about another part of it. Oh no! Wait, I'm looking for. Who am I looking for? Not Millay, but. Right, Sanger. I got her here somewhere. Oh, here it is. She's a little further on. Sanger had called for a birth strike as early as 1910 when, the subject of birth control attained a kind of unofficial imprimatur when Sanger was chosen to deliver the keynote address at the first annual Summer Institute of Euthenics at Vassar College. Now, euthenics was it dealt with the science of improving society through the improvement of living conditions. It was a term that was coined by a Vassar woman professor, Ellen Swallow Richards, in 1905, and it was promoted by McCracken. The New York Times called to get together a workshop on child development and race improvement, but in Sanger's hands, it took on the aspect of a race cleansing movement as well. She had been advocating a new science of eugenics in the Birth Control Review. Maybe she got it mixed up, euthenics, eugenics, they sound the same, so I'll give this talk instead. And she said, "The American public is heavily taxed to maintain an increasing race of morons, which threatens the very foundations of our civilization," she said in a Vassar speech that became infamous. Sanger went on to bemoan the outrageous expense of asylums, prisons, and institutions for the care of the defective and diseased. And one of them was well, there were a couple of them. One of them was in Middletown, the biggest, and there was one in Napanoch, the Eastern Institute for Mentally Defective Delinquents. Imagine having a title like that for an institution today. Anyway, At the time of her advocacy for eugenics, Sanger's focus represented a more respectable approach to the subject than birth control for population growth because it came from a fiscally conservative viewpoint. She approved of strict immigration laws on the same regressive principle, namely that keeping out the woebegone and unfortunate would protect America's gene pool. I wonder who she'd vote for this year. Yeah, Hillary, that's right. Yeah. It's always better to be true to your kind than your politics, I think. Now, so let me move along here. And Edith Wharton, wonderful figure, wonderful hero of mine. Of course, she, this great writer. One of her books, Hudson River Bracketed, is set in the Hudson Valley. The first of her great books, what was it called? The House of Mirth, probably opened at the mansion at Statsburg, the Mills Mansion at Statsburg, which Edith wasn't very impressed with, actually. I've seen it, and I was pretty impressed with it. It's a huge place. But she lived in Lenox, and after 1900, her greatest passion was her automobile. And she used to take these excursions. And in 1907, she and Henry James came driving over to Hudson. And she would go further and further, especially after the invention of the rear view mirror, which was the greatest technological advance for her. And they came over to Hudson. Of course, Henry James was this a terribly officious person who didn't like anything pretty much that smacked of ordinariness. And he was shocked when the local hotel owner wouldn't let them in to have dinner because they had a dog. And they wound up going to a local pastisserie or a bakery where they set them up in the back room and they had a great meal. Edith Wharton would drive around everywhere in the car, and the few days that they did spend in Hudson was memorable for the notes that both kept about it, and also the notes that some of the Hudson people kept about these people who came here. I would say that Henry James was out-disdained, the great disdainer was out-disdained by some of the Hudson comments, which said that, this guy is not anywhere near what he's cracked up to be. I'm a little critical of James, I think, because I've had the unfortunate of having to read a lot of his stuff. Madame Jumel, we'll go on with that one. She was Eliza Brown, and she shook up Saratoga's Henry James type class with her carriages. Let's see. Inez, okay. Oh, back in the 1880s, and of course this is a famous and a very proud story of Hudson Valley history, with the collar workers and union in Troy. And there are three women who started that: Kate Mullaney, Esther Keegan, and Sarah McQuinlan. And Kate Mullaney went on to become a leader of women unions nationally as well. There were important political and feisty women like that throughout history, and I happen to have known a few of them in my own town. Fortunately, they knew my mother too, so I got away with it. But the suffrage movement, the women in industry, women in war service, even the Rockland County housewives show up in this history. And I'll talk about a little bit of that as we go along. Of course, the most famous women in Hudson Valley history were the Roosevelts: Eleanor Roosevelt, her mother Sarah Roosevelt, and in a curious way, Theodore Roosevelt's wife and mother. His wife's name was Alice Roosevelt, and his mother was called Mittie by the family. And in 1884, Theodore Roosevelt was an assemblyman in New York. There's a whole section about TR in here. What an incredible figure he was. And he knew that his wife and his mother were ill. Their baby had just been born the day before, and the mother didn't know it, but she had Bright's disease. And that's Alice, TR's wife. Meanwhile, the mother herself was also dying. And TR came down from Albany in an excruciatingly slow train that hit a fog coming out of Westchester County. It took him another hour just to get down to Manhattan. And he got into the house after midnight on February 14th, Valentine's Day, and rushed upstairs to sit with his mother while she died in his presence, and then rushed into another room and sat with his wife, who died in his presence as well on Valentine's Day. I mean, that would be enough, I would think, to prostrate any man into inabilities. But TR, he did finish out his term and another term, and then he went out west to the Badlands and spent 10 years and that became famous with his conservation work that followed from that. But such a tragedy like that is hard to imagine. Of course, there were tragedies like that struck all over. The people who owned Yaddo, currently it's an artist's retreat in Saratoga Springs. 4 of their 5 children died within the same week of diphtheria. And it could have been avoided, but the father saw that his wife had diphtheria bad, and so one by one he brought the children in to say goodbye to her. And each one of them, it got them and killed them, and she survived. You know, we have hard lives ourselves, but you know, to imagine what it must have been like in the 18th century and before just is unbelievable. Let's talk a bit about the Beekmans. The Livingstons. It's an interesting fact that from Margaret Beekman Livingston, now she was the wife of the Chancellor of Livingston, Robert Livingston. From her, for the next 100 years, every important Livingston home that was built under the impetus, direction, supervision, and guardful eye of women in the Livingston family. Yes?
Can I ask exactly, the Chancellor, what was their authority or their position? Because the position's no longer around. I'm wondering what they did.
Well, he was basically the chief judge of the state. That was his basic role. He was the guy who swore in George Washington as president, because it happened here in New York State. And this is before the evolution of the Supreme Court. There was a Supreme Court in the state at the time, but that judge didn't have that type of authority. And I think that lasted until the Constitution of 1848. And
The position was eliminated?
Margaret Beekman Livingston was the resident property owner when the British came upriver in 1777 and burned Claremont. And right away she picked up the phone and called George Clinton, the governor at the time, and said, "Send me some of your men. I have to rebuild the house immediately. We have to show the British that they will not stop us, that for every one of us that they put down, a phoenix will rise of 8 or more ahead of them and defeat them that way." And George Clinton pulled men out of the ranks of fighting the war, and they did that. And that was her. She actually was the person years before who had recommended George Clinton become governor, and that's how he became governor. And you wouldn't have thought that was possible, because he was from the other side of the river, not the landed property owner, but the representative of the regular farmers, the independent farmers. Yet he had a special relationship with the aristocracy that helped him in later years, even though they differed politically. He was a Federalist, Robert Livingston, he was an anti-Federalist. Robert Livingston was a Federalist, and George Clinton maintained an iron hold on that during his terms as governor of New York. He was the longest serving governor in the history of New York. Now today there are 40 Livingston houses in the 40 miles between Poughkeepsie and Hudson that are still owned and lived in by members of the Livingston family. And all those houses were built under the leadership of the women of the family. Oh yeah, the Astors and the Astor orphans. So the Astor family goes back to, of course, John Jacob Astor, who came up the river in the 1780s or 1770s, 60s. I don't know. It was around that time. Gebhardt was the minister down in Kinderhook, so it would be the 1770s and 80s. And John Jacob Astor had really originally come over to sell musical instruments here, but on the way over, the ship got mired in a doldrum or something and spent 2 weeks kind of almost abandoned off the coast of Virginia. And he got to know a man who told him about pelt trading, about trading in furs. And the man took him under wing and they became partners. So every spring, John Jacob Astor would come upriver to the first of the trading posts. It was actually in Cotsbon, in the town of Saugerties. And from there he would go across the river and go up to Kinderhook and visit with Gebhardt, who had come from his town of Astoria. And Gebhardt was the older man whom all the younger men had looked up to and who had wanted to emulate in how when they migrated to America. So they would sit around and play musical instruments together. And from there, Astor would go to Albany and make his various trade deals, and then he kept going west and west and west until he got out to the Pacific coast. But he left a progeny, a family around that was pretty spectacular. One of his daughters was Margaret, who married General Armstrong, who was ignominiously the Secretary of Defense when the British came and burned Washington in 1814. He didn't look too good in that picture. So he retired and came home and built Rokeby, a beautiful estate in Dutchess County that is still in Livingston family name. And Margaret couldn't own the property, so her father bought it and gave it to the husband. And it became the home of the Astor descendants, Livingston descendants after that. And two of those were a couple that died within a couple of years of each other and left 11 children. And 3 of the children died in infancy or close to it, and there were 8 children who remained living in Rokeby, and there was a big discussion among the family. But this time, the Astors were the wealthiest family in America. The Elizabeth Schermerhorn Astor was Lena, she was known as, was the leader of the 400. Have you heard of the 400, the social register in New York? You know where the term 400 comes from? It's exactly how many, yeah.
Well, Mrs. Astor's ballroom held 400 people.
That's it. That's exactly right, yeah. And of course, they could have done anything they wanted with the children. Some of the family members were saying, let's farm them out to other family members. But the children kept saying, no, we want to stay together. We want to live here. And they finally agreed to that. And the 8 of them grew up in this house with a couple of chaperones, but more or less romping around together. And each of them have tremendously interesting personalities. And I don't want to get into too much of it, but it's they were able to do all that. It's a big estate, a big house, 8 children, 1 bathroom, and they managed to get by with all of that. Let me just talk about a couple of the daughters. There were 3 daughters in the group, and Elizabeth Chandler Chapman. Here it is. So, some of these. I have to talk about 1 or 2 others. Sheriff Bob, Robert Winthrop Chandler. He became an artist, but before that he lived in hedonistic pleasure, as they said, and he carried on an expensive campaign for Dutchess County Sheriff. He looked the part, 6'5", with a fearless aspect, and got elected. Sheriff Bob, as he was known to all after that, including the family, was the only Democratic sheriff in the county's history until then. But then he became smitten with art and became an artist, and he was the most important American artist at the Armory Show in 1913. There is an image of one of his works of art in this book. But the sisters were, they grew up under careful tutelage, of course. Elizabeth, the oldest, she became disabled with a hip disease at the age of 13, and spent half a dozen years recovering to the point of being able to walk with difficulty again. She had resigned herself to a celibate life when she unexpectedly fell in love with the husband of a good friend. Margaret, a sister, realized what happened and spirited her sister away on a round-the-world tour. While in India, they learned that the friend's wife had died, so Elizabeth quickly returned, a respectable romance ensued, and eventually she married John J. Chapman, a descendant of the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John J. And he was a brilliant yet difficult man of unusual passions. In the courtship of his first wife in 1887, after learning that a man he assaulted had been falsely accused, Chapman was so abashed he thrust his fist into a coal fire and held it there until it was so mutilated it had to be amputated. This woman falls in love with this guy. They married in 1898 and settled on a farm next to Rokeby. He left the legal profession and devoted himself to criticism and letters, starting with a book entitled Emerson and Other Essays. He introduced Oscar Wilde to John Burroughs, which was an interesting visit for Burroughs, who concluded that Wilde was a splendid talker, a handsome man, but a voluptuary. Chapman was also a playwright and poet. Edmund Wilson once characterized him as America's best writer on literature of his generation. Another sister, Margaret, one who helped Elizabeth, she was called the Angel of Puerto Rico, and she received a Congressional Gold Medal for her work as a nurse administrator in hospitals during the Spanish-American War there. Her agitation resulted in the creation of a nursing corps within the U.S. Army. She's the one who bought out her siblings in Rokeby and became the owner of Rokeby. She married New York Times music critic Richard Aldrich in 1906. She was a quiet, reserved woman with a rule at Rokeby to never have dinner with a divorcee. Emily Post was among those thus debarred. On the one occasion when she actually had tea with one of them, Margaret pointedly did not remove her hat. The 8th surviving child was Alida Beekman Chandler, a woman of such dark beauty. It was said that Tsar Nicholas II of Russia chose his wife because of their resemblance. She married a descendant of a distinguished Irish family. And it was such a wedding, Stanford White supervised the decorations. There was a special train from New York for 200 guests that came up. But Alida flopped to Romanism, as her brother Archie put it, and was banned from Rokeby for her Catholicism, the feud between she and her sister Margaret lasting for more than 40 years. Alida outlasted all her siblings, however, and was considered the last of the 400 when she died in 1969. Now, let's get up into modern times. And in my world, one of the characters was a woman named Rita Gavigan. Rita wrote a kind of a colorful column, no names, about local gossip in the local paper in Saugerties in the 40s. She and her sister Mary used to meet every day at 4 o'clock and start with the Manhattans. And of course they were Irish and they got into the problems and difficulties of every character that they could think of. Rita, however, manned the observation post during World War II. Now, up and down the valley, there were these hills that were used for people to come up. It was a particular civilian corps that came up and watched for aircraft coming over. And they would radio down to Stewart Island which plane it was. They were trained in recognizing them by the wingspan and things of that nature. And Rita ran that through World War II. And then in 1957, I remember distinctly my mother saying, come on, let's hurry, we've got to go, Rita wants us, we have to go up to Nanny Goat Hill. And come on, Vernon, she said, and she took me and the dog, Dewey, and we walked along behind them. And we got up on that hill, and I'll never forget it, it's so vivid in my mind. We're looking up at the sky, and there goes this red blip coming across the sky, October 7th, 1958, Sputnik. appears for the first time. I looked at the faces of the people around me, and each one had a very fearful aspect on it. And I knew as a kid, well, this is an important moment. Rita was quite an interesting person. Another in my town was a woman named Rosetta Winchell. She was known as the mayor of West Camp. They say she used to sit around on her porch and smoke laudanum. I don't think so, but you never know. She was 92 when I interviewed her in 1996, I think. And she remembered the hobos coming over the hill in the Great Depression and knocking on the door and asking for a piece of bread or something, and she never would deny them. And she remembered electrification, which for her was a tremendous blessing because no more candles, no more fires at night. And she thought that was the greatest safety thing that could happen. She was also in the war industry. I want to get into a couple of people like that. She was in the war industry in Saugerties when General Electric had a little plant there. And the war industry there, as in other towns, was run by the most important individual in the town. In this case, it was the school superintendent. His name was Morse. And she was showing up late for work now and then, and he called her in and said, I want to know what's going on, why can't you be there? And she turned on him and said, I'm on important business, and I'm not going to tell you or anybody else about it, and that's it, you can live with it. And Dr. Morse kind of reached back, and he knew who he was dealing with, and he said, okay, Rosetta, you go ahead and do whatever you want, try and come into work whenever you can. Turns out that her son was a state trooper in Virginia at the future Camp David, and one of the state troopers who took care of the president when he came there. So when he came home, Rosetta went home to get the scoop on what was happening nationally, you know, and something that she felt very close to and personal with the president and national issues because of it. Women were anxious to participate in life in all ways in this history, I'm finding. And look at World War II. Aileen Gilbert Steyer. She graduates from high school on Saturday. On Monday, she's on a bus to General Electric in Schenectady and works there during the war in the industry. She's an expert mathematician, she's an expert draftsman, and an expert artist, and as a teenager still. So she got an important job. Her biggest memory was the disgust that she and her friends felt when going to lunch and they had to wait for all the tanks to drive by before they could cross the street. That's what they were producing at GE at the time. Joan Waters Keefe. Joan Keefe is 93 years old. She lives in a retirement home in Kingston now. Her fame came in later years locally when she became a major peace pacifist and would march and carry signs and do all of these things. She and a fellow named Jay Wenk got arrested for protesting the signing up of students for the Army at the local mall, and they got arrested for trespassing on private property in the mall, and they happily went to jail. Well, during World War II, Joan Keefe was one of the first of the WAC women, WAC, Women's Army Corps. And like all of her colleagues, she felt indignant that they were consigned to secretarial and other menial skills, they felt. She dreamed of driving an ambulance in France during the heaviest fighting. I wanted to kill Germans, she told me when I interviewed her. Art, of course, has been a refuge for women as well as men over the years, and we have Woodstock, and Woodstock's artist community included many women of note, most of whose names are not well known today. I think that will change over time. I think that the attention that's given to Woodstock these days is growing, and that there's an understanding that the art community there from the 1910s on was a significant one. There was something known as the Woodstock School of Art in the 1930s. A woman named Juliana Force came up. She worked for Peggy Guggenheim, who established the Whitney Museum. And Juliana bought paintings in Woodstock. Whenever the word went out that she had come in on the train, well, the word would go out, Mrs. Force is here, among the artists, and they would all like bring out their best paintings and kind of stand there and show them to her. There was one case where she was in a hurry to go home, and she wanted to get this painting from the one artist, so she broke into his window and climbed into the house and left a $200 check for him afterwards. A good deal of the early Whitney Museum collection was raised from among these artists by Juliana Force, and she had a house there too. Another famous person in one time was Wilner Hervey. Wilner Hervey and Dan Mason came together as a result of the Toonerville Trolley movies. Remember, who would remember the Toonerville Trolley comics? These were in the silent area, the 19-teens and 20s. A famous comic strip that originated in New Rochelle about this Toonerville trolley, this kind of hapless trolley, and the people associated with it. And one of them was a woman named Katrinka, but she was known as Powerful Katrinka. She was a very huge person, Wilner Harvey was, and she became Powerful Katrinka, and became very famous. The young boy who was in those movies, his name was Joe Yule Jr., and after that was over, he decided that he might, try and have a career in the movies. So he changed his name and started to make movies. His name was Mickey Rooney, and he just died a couple of years ago. Powerful Katrinka and Nan lived together in Woodstock, and they revived the old Maverick festivals, which were these great parties that were held in the 20s, and they would have their own parties there, so they were known for that. She was so powerful that she got upset with a plumber who was digging in a hole, digging down to get the pump, when she discovered that he had drunk half of their hard cider, and she pulled him up by the scruff of his jacket, his whole body, held him up like this, and said, "What did you do that for?" I mean, you can imagine, the strength of this woman, and they took advantage of that in the Toonerville Trolley, the silent shows as well. Marion Bullard was one woman who was also associated with Woodstock artists and was a good artist herself. Her first impression of Woodstock artists was when she came up on the stagecoach, and she had to wait for the stagecoach driver to go in and get a haircut. And while she did, 4 men who she later became very close friends with walked out with their haircuts, and one of them had his initials just shaved into his head. Another just had part of his head shaved, and one of them had a whole face on the back of his head cut out of hair. And she thought, "Oh, what am I doing here?" But there were a number of women like that who were just, not free spirits like Vincent Millay, so much as adventurous persons. Anita Smith, who also was one of the Hilltop Corps members watching for the Luftwaffe in World War II. She she formed a Friends of France group in Woodstock. She cashed in the money that her family gave her to buy a ballroom gown, and came to Woodstock and hid out there for a couple of months until they found out where she was, and she stayed. A woman named Marianne Apple also arrived in kind of a grand scale in a limousine with her mother, and stayed. And she used to have her favorite pastime. She had a beautiful pearl-handled pistol, was target shooting from her roof, and to the dismay of many of the local residents. Marianne Apple did some very nice paintings in the WPA program. There are others that are unknown today, but I think in time, and the unknown woman is really the hero of the history in so many ways. I mean, when you go back to the colonial times, there was a woman named Mary Sears who wrote a novel called Hudson Crossroads, and she said in the book, she said, we all think of history and remember history as the accomplishments of great political heroes and military heroes, but rarely do you see the stories of the lying in of the women, having babies, and she devoted the book to that, but that was the hard life for women, and particularly in the Native American times, the women lived shorter lives than the men because they did most of the work. I'm not sure if that's true in colonial times, but certainly the women not only were very heavily involved in the labors of the household and the estate, but also had a lot to say about what was done in the background. Under the English period, they could not come forward. They were restricted. They had no rights at all. They were considered wards of the husbands. In modern times, you run into cases like the brickyards along the river. One of them in Glasgow was Italian, and a little community developed there. And there's an archaeological record of a great of what life was like in that community. And some of it involved the role of the women coming out and participating in the butchering and the preparation of the food. Whenever a hog was butchered, the woman would get out her best stainless steel pan. It was only used for one thing, to collect the blood from the hog. And the blood sausage was made from that. And you can still get blood sausage in some of these old households if you know who to talk to in Glasgow these days. I want to end up now, but I wanted to call to your attention or remind you about back in this area as well. Something that happened in 2005, you probably know about it. It was a sewer construction project that was going on by the Shaker village, and they came across an unmarked slave cemetery. One man and several women were in it, and the bioarchaeology division of the Cultural Center of New York State got the skeletons of them and brought in an expert who recreated what the faces looked like. And there was a show like last spring at the Cultural Center displaying these faces. I saw this, and it was amazing. I mean, here you know people died, people lived there, people died, slaves and that, but here you could see the person's face and a lot of the personality in the process. And a wonderful thing happened. St. Agnes, the church down by Waterloo, offered space in their cemetery for them, and the bodies were interned there following a formal service at St. Agnes as well. And I know this well because one of my cousins, Chrétien Verge, was the one who was involved in it for the town of Colonie. He's the public works superintendent. The town supervisor at the time was also a woman, Mary Bursell. You guys know her? Okay, one other story, my favorite, concerns Cassie Calhoun. This is about a year ago, 100 years ago. There was a woman named, known as the Public Universal Friend, who led a group of Shaker-like people in religious studies and that. And she was bringing some new converts over from New England to their home in Penn Yan, Pennsylvania. And they crossed the river at Poughkeepsie, and she died. And that created a big problem because these were poor people. Some of them went on to Penn Yan, but some of them moved into shacks in the hills behind the town of Lloyd, behind Highland, on the west side of the river, across in Poughkeepsie. And over time, they became known as the Penyangers to the locals. These are the families where the kids were retarded, or they were so poor that you didn't know what you could do for them and that, and became a part of the local scene. There was one woman named Cassie Calhoun who lived in a shack up against the railroad, and the fence in the railroad came open, and her cow went through the fence and got struck and killed by a train. And she went to the railroad and wanted to be paid for the cow. And they said, "Oh, come on, old lady, we're not going to help you. You're not only old and decrepit, you're a Penyanger. We wouldn't bother with you." So she went home and she got the remains of the cow, and she boiled up some of it and created lard, and got a pail of lard and took a paintbrush and went out and walked up the hill and painted the rail going up and coming back down. The next train to come through was the $1 Million meat train that came through every day from Chicago. And it was the little train that couldn't. It got almost to the top, and then the wheels started to spin, and it slid back down. It backed up and tried again. Backed up 3 times, it tried it, and it couldn't get over the hill. they had to bring in 2 locomotives from Croton in order to pull the train over the hill. The next day, they paid her for the cow. So there you go. Thank you.